Okay, I think it's a good time to get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm incredibly excited to be here. I'm incredibly excited to have the visitors, our speakers who have agreed to come to Bentley today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about what is about the best combination of great science, great business, public policy that I've ever encountered. And I'm not going to tell you the story, I'm going to let the speakers tell you the story. But we are going to start today with President Larson to both introduce Bentley to our speakers and introduce why we think this is such a great fit for those of you who are students and also for visitors to our campus. It's a pleasure to introduce President Larson.
Thank you so much, Fred, and welcome everyone. This is so exciting to once again see Wilder filled with many students I know from different courses, faculty members, staff, and of course a lot of outside visitors to Bentley too. So I'm going to say a few things that I'm sure everyone who's from Bentley can recite in their sleep, but I'm also going to say some things about Fred and his work and what the Center's all about in this business series. But a huge thank you to everybody for being here today. I am a huge fan of the Innovator's business series, and I am an even bigger fan of our Center for Integration of Science and Industry, and I want to tell you why. The overarching mission, as some of you already know, is to speed up the public benefits from scientific and technological discoveries. When you think about it, even in today's very fast-paced world of advances, think IT, think biomedical science, think green energy, so many things are happening, but are they being distributed globally on a large scale? Are they meeting the expectations of all the challenges that are out there? So the Center says no, and I think we all realize that things aren't changing people's lives at the pace we want them to. And the Center hopes to play and is already playing a role in thinking differently about this. And they're doing it in the usual Bentley multidisciplinary, multi-career pathways. They're bringing together researchers, fellows, students, business executives to work together to uncover different types of business strategies and models that can more efficiently take science, think of pure and applied science, and translate it, the breakthroughs that are happening for the much greater public good. So think about what can be wrought from the genius, the sheer genius, and we'll hear a little bit about how that genius comes to life a little later, but the sheer genius that exists behind pure and applied science, and then you combine that with innovative business models and smart public policy, and together those things can lead to breakthrough moments for society writ large. That's exactly what Fred and his colleagues are up to at the Center. That's what they're working on to imagine and then to realize. So we couldn't be luckier to have Fred and the Center resident at Bentley University, and a huge round of applause for the guy who's helping every day to make this happen. So complementing the work of the series is the way that we distribute the conversations we're having in the Center more broadly with the public. And it's really fun to shine a bright spotlight on some of the industry leaders who are already figuring out in the biopharma world and healthcare, in high tech and in the green sciences, just how do we more effectively connect these dots between science, business, and policy makers. And that's exactly what today's panel is going to be about. Just thinking, and we could not have picked a better subject when you think about the creation of Humira, a life-changing medication for arthritis and other autoimmune diseases. We happen to think Bentley University is the pitch-perfect place to have conversations like this, and that's because we are distinctive. I don't believe in calling anything unique in this universe, but we are certainly distinctive when it comes in the U.S. to being a standalone business university. We've had a century-long commitment to innovating and thinking about how can we revolutionize and transform business education to meet not just today's needs, but next generation needs. And as luck would have it, this year, 100 years ago, Harry Bentley opened his one-room School of Accounting and Finance on Boylston Street in Boston. He understood traditional bookkeeping really well, but he saw this amazing opportunity to unlock the new profession of accountancy and finance, just as the finance industry was starting to take off in the United States. So imagine how exciting it is to be celebrating our centennial this year. And while we continue to lead in the world of accountancy, we've grown a lot bigger and much more diverse than that one-room accounting school 100 years ago. Today we have 24 different majors that span a very broad spectrum across business and the arts and sciences. Our classrooms remain laboratories of invention. Our faculty collaborate day in and day out across and within these disciplines. And our curriculum, I'm really proud to say, because I think it's one of our most distinctive qualities, reflects this. Now, we refer to it as academic fusion. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going into detail about what that really means. But when you think about genuine integration with a unified faculty of business and arts and sciences faculty members, and you think about full-scale integration both inside and outside the classroom, it's been a huge differentiator for us, and it's why this past year we landed in Bloomberg Business Week's top 10 business undergraduate schools, something we're incredibly proud of. Now, thanks to Fusion, our students, and I'm looking at them, they know this well, they live and breathe this, they combine their coursework and their projects in a wide variety of disciplines. They get to gain subject matter knowledge in depth, and at the same time, broader-based communication skills, team building skills. I think every project at Bentley involves a team of some sort or another, as well as much important analytical skills, and that's exactly what we hear from employers is what's needed in today's global innovation economy. I think of it in terms of creativity and analytical skills, left and right brain, something Daniel Pink described a dozen years ago, hoping that somewhere, some place would think of a way to fully bring along the next generation of students so that they're ready for where the innovation economy won't just take them when they land their first job, but throughout a long career. Not surprisingly, when you get this deep into Fusion, our students are clamoring for roles in the biopharma and healthcare sector. And these days, Bentley's just named #1 career services office in the country is helping our students land internships first in healthcare, in hospitals, biopharma companies. But what's important is these lead to phenomenal first jobs and then, of course, lifelong careers for our students. Multidisciplinary collaboration is not just resident in the classroom. When you think about our teacher scholars, we have figured out, and I'm looking at several of our faculty members who really exemplify this, just how to collaborate, again, across business and arts and sciences and within these areas, and to not just have this influence what's happening in the classroom, but think how it influences an organizational world that wants this merger of left and right brain thinking. One of the best examples I can think of is a co-sponsor today, and that is Bentley's Health Thought Leadership Network, very ably led by Professor Danielle Hartigan. And Danielle, where are you? Right there in the second row. A huge thank you to you, because what this Thought Leadership Network is doing with respect to Fusion, you are taking us to, yet as is true with several of our other now emerging thought leadership networks, to a whole new level when it comes to applying this to thought leadership research within the university, but also bringing in business partners, bringing in biopharma companies in our region. This is a perfect opportunity to take what you already have, which is 17 different business and liberal arts departments, scores of faculty across these, who all manage to get along and get together to think about next generation research. I'm incredibly excited. I don't want to pile too much pressure on your shoulders, but we expect really great things from this particular Thought Leadership Network. And I'm saying this even though it was formed a year ago. But let me just mention a couple of the areas of current research. Patients and provider communications, healthcare systems and information, outcomes and measures, and technology and innovation. These are wonderful, wonderful opportunities for our resident faculty as well as visiting faculty and, of course, your partners in the region beyond. So thank you again for that. We've also made a recent commitment to biotech through our executive education program. This is in collaboration, once again, with Fred and the Center for Integration of Science and Industry. We're going to to be launching our first mini MBA in the business of biotechnology. It's a 6-day intensive program. Students are going to be absolutely immersed. You can imagine over 6 days it's going to feel like boot camp on speed. I think business and management skills that are required in the biopharma industry. We all look forward to this mini MBA because I think once launched, it's going to be resonant here for many years to come. So, today, though, is about a particular story, one that was incredibly important for society, again, writ large, but very important for the Commonwealth as well. And it's the story behind the development of one of the world's most successful medicines, Humira. We couldn't be more fortunate to have 3 individuals sitting on the front row who have brought this life-changing promise drug to reality. They were way ahead of their time. A subsidiary of BASF Bio, was attracted to Worcester, Massachusetts, groundbreaking, state-of-the-art, state-sponsored biotech research park that was created in the mid-1980s under the leadership, and I have to say, the uncommon vision of a highly visionary governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. So imagine how thrilled we are to have all 3 of you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. The breakthroughs that ultimately led to Humira were enabled by, again, I like to think of this was fusion at its best at an early stage decades ago, but led by Bob Kamen, then president of BASF Bio, and his really the brain power, the emerging science and technology that went into this, but then also that accompanied by the business acumen of Bentley alumnus Bob Anderson, then General Counsel of the company. These 3 visionaries, all of us can learn firsthand. This is such a good example of what the integration of business, science, and policy can lead to as a catalyst for innovation at its very best. Humira has dramatically improved the lives of people with rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, and so many other inflammatory disorders, while also creating countless jobs in Massachusetts, spurring economic growth in Worcester, and generating profits for the businesses involved. To me, this is the magic of the right kind of fusion in the business sector. It's all about triple bottom line thinking. This is something that Bentley students are all immersed in. Of course, we believe in bottom line profits, but they always have to be accompanied by concerns, care, and focus on society, on people and our planet, just as much as profits. When you think about economic and social gain across the globe, this is exactly what happens. It's magic in a sense, but it's magic that only comes when you have the right ingredients all brought together, which is what we have today. What I think is so cool about the story you're going to hear today is that it can be replicated by others working in emerging science and technology fields. When you think about the challenges we all know exist today in our country and across the globe, we're also seeing emerging challenges, some of them at accelerated pace. As I look at some of those involved in climate change on our faculty and in the healthcare fields, and the ability to use something beyond the confines of just the brain matter in a company, just the brain matter from public policy officials and those in the corporate sector to make this happen at a faster pace. So just a few words, and then I'm going to let Fred make a proper introduction when he moderates the panel. But I want to say a couple of personal things about the panelists today. Governor Dukakis, I have called you a colleague and a friend for many, many years. I'd like to think I was a small child when we first met, but that's not true. This was decades ago, and I couldn't be more proud to know you, and I know you will give Kitty our love too. I'm sorry she couldn't join us today, but the vision and dedication you had in seeding this biotech park. Remember, this was back in the 1980s. To have had the vision to do this, to take this untilled soil at a place that had a great Massachusetts medical school resident there, but an economy in the middle part of the state that needed additional jump starting, was really powerful vision for not just what was needed then, but for the future. Obviously, our state has grown much stronger economically because of the biotech sector, and the world's a lot safer and a lot healthier because of the dedication that you applied to getting this done several decades ago. I have to say, You really are the guy that put Massachusetts on the map as an international leader today when it comes to the biotech world by deciding that this biotech park should start in the middle 80s in Massachusetts. And Dr. Kamen, we're so thrilled to have you at Bentley this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I know there are so many here who would love to follow in your footsteps as a biotech pioneer, but I think even more broadly as an investor in all of our collective futures. And Bob Anderson, welcome back to your university. We are so glad to have you. We are responsible for your master's degree in taxation. You were letting me know that among that 1,000 participants in our kickoff for our centennial downtown a couple of weeks ago, that you were there, and we are thrilled to have you as an alumni, and you were invited back along with Dr. Kamen at any time. So together, though, when I look at the two of you, your shared dedication to the biosciences has helped millions, literally millions of patients across the globe, and we can't wait to hear from you today. And I've saved another thank you for my final remarks, and that's to another close friend and colleague for many, many years. I think we were both small children when we met, and that's Bob Coughlin, who's the president and CEO of the Massachusetts Biotech Council. What you are doing, and you're going to share this following our panel, with your collection of companies and your collection of researchers and public and private universities to spur further bioresearch and technology is awesome, and it's going to make our state able to lay claim to dibs to top honors in this area for many, many generations to come. So this is a really important conversation. I'm thrilled to have so many students here, and I know you're all going to enjoy it. I'm going to invite our speakers to the stage. I know they want to take one formal photograph before the panel starts, and honestly, I couldn't be more excited to see you all here on our campus and to have so many students and faculty and others in our community hear what you all have to talk about today. This is a story worth hearing. Thank you, thank you. So, please join me on stage.
Great. So thank you, Gloria. We know that you have a shoehorn schedule today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to introduce the panel and welcome our visitors to Bentley. It's great to see so many of you here, and you all have fairly comprehensive bios of our speakers, so I'm not going to really repeat any of that. I want to point out just a couple of little things. One is Governor Dukakis. It's great to have you here. And Governor Dukakis has just written a book, which I hope you guys read, about why young people should get involved in politics. And I know this is another important theme here, where our Service Learning Center is now a center for service learning and civic engagement. And I hope that's one of the themes to take away from here. And maybe let me start by asking you a question. Before we get into the details of Humira, at the time the Biotech Park was created in Worcester, it was not obvious that communities were going to adopt recombinant DNA and genetic engineering. I was at MIT a couple of years before that, and the city of Cambridge was actually thinking about banning it during your first term as governor. And biotech has always had this relationship with public policy. It's had such an impact on lives, so what was your thinking about it at the time, and how do you see this field and its relationship to public policy?
Well, I was elected for the first time in 1974 as governor. Then I got defeated in 78 and came back and won in 82. And Massachusetts in the mid-70s was a basket case economically. I mean, they were calling us the new Appalachia. It was all about Sun Belt, Frost Belt. Our traditional industrial base had gone. Textiles, shoes were disappearing. We had a kind of mini revival along 128 in the military technology area, but by the mid-70s, Vietnam was fading away and defense budgets were being cut and so forth. And it wasn't only that we had the second highest unemployment rate in the country, the unemployment rate in our older industrial communities, like Worcester, or Lowell, or Fall River, New Bedford, was in the 20s. This was Depression stuff. And although I thought I did a pretty good job of getting us back on our feet by 1978, I think I was about 40 points ahead in the polls 5 weeks before that Democratic primary. Ed King beat me, which was a pretty good signal that folks weren't feeling quite as good as I was about what was happening. Well, I came back and beat King in '82, but I wasn't the guy that originated this idea. It was the greater Worcester Chamber of Commerce. Kevin, where are you? Kevin O'Sullivan and Bill Shortsleeve and these guys and the Greater Worcester Chamber of Commerce who came up with this preposterous idea that we could turn Worcester into a biotech center. But the state had made a very important investment in Worcester in the form of the UMass Medical School. I think without UMass Medical, I don't think Kevin would have been talking about biotech. The fact that I was a failed pre-med helped, I think. But when I came back in '83, this focus of our economic development efforts on the older industrial communities in this state was real. And we were obviously looking for ways to spark that revival. And the Greater Worcester Chamber of Commerce came along and said, we think we can do a biotech park out here. For reasons I never understood, the King administration just couldn't seem to put it together. And I do remember a very hot day in August of '82, about a month before that primary, where I and Jerry D'Amico, the state senator, were in this meadow with grass up to our armpits. It must have been 99 in the shade, and I was announcing that if I was elected, we were going to get that biotech park to Worcester. And by God, we were able to do so. But as always, this was a collaborative effort. The inspiration for it came out of Worcester. One of the nice things about being governor is that you can pick up on this stuff. We also ought to say thanks to the activists in Cambridge who were raising all kinds of objections to biotech in Cambridge. I mean, I don't know what recombinant DNA is, but there was a feeling in Cambridge that somehow this was dangerous. You know, if it got out the door and started going down the street, that things would happen. And I will take credit for one thing, saying to my development people, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to go out to the older urban industrial communities and take advantage of this. Let's help them. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Kevin, that we helped Worcester develop a safety code and that kind of thing in advance, so that when BASF came on board and came along, we didn't have to go through another struggle to kind of get Worcester to be ready for this thing. And in point of fact, as you can imagine, the folks in our older urban and industrial communities were dying to get this stuff, and we thought we could be helpful. So from a very hot August day, I'll never forget it, we now have 3,000 biotech jobs in Worcester, folks. And seems almost inconceivable going back to that. But it's a great, talk about fusion, I mean, it's a great way for government and private sector and an activist community to go to work and make things happen. And that's why you run for governor, folks, so you can at least be a part of this, and I'm tickled to death. I mean, I think what's happened out there is great. And now Worcester is expanding there's going to be a new bioengineering park, and that's moving, and so great things are happening. And we've also connected Worcester with Boston with some decent train service, which isn't hurting either. So a combination of all of these things have really made a difference.
So, Dr. Kamen, we have a lot of Bobs on this panel, so it's very hard to be completely informed. But you were both already with BASF and a very small subsidiary. I think you said you had 10 people, temporary facilities in Cambridge. How'd you get started? And
maybe we should pick up on the policy topic.
Absolutely.
First of all, maybe we should introduce some of the, first of all, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a topic I love to discuss. And, you know, we're going to talk about the Humira story, but at least the comments I'll make will be a lot about the people involved. Because Humira is the most successful pharmaceutical product ever made. This year's annual sales will exceed 16 billion, I believe, and we're helping millions of people have normal lives who suffer from otherwise very painful autoimmune diseases. But a drug like this is made by people, a very large number of people, and as I talk, I'm going to try to mention the names. You don't have to remember the names, but I think it's very important to tell a human story from the point of view of who contributed, who was critical, who, if they hadn't been there, the project wouldn't have existed. And for this audience, it's important to remember that many of these people were young, inexperienced, doing something that they had no right to know how to do. And that's what makes a successful product or treatment. But coming back to the policy issue, first I have to make an introduction. So BASF, which probably nobody in this room has ever heard of, or few have, was at that time and now certainly is the world's largest chemical company. It is a giant. The US subsidiary is a Fortune 100 company and has 47 major manufacturing sites in the US alone. When I was recruited, BASF had 120,000 employees worldwide, 70,000 on the headquarters site in Germany. This is a big player which was dabbling a little bit in pharmaceuticals. They had started a biotech collaboration with a company called Biogen, which at that point was a startup in Cambridge, to make, as a pharmaceutical product to treat cancer, a protein called TNF. And they had a collaboration going, and the BASF scientists were pretty excited about what Biogen was doing and about recombinant DNA in general, and thought, no, maybe they should have a research lab in Cambridge, not Worcester, Cambridge. That idea didn't fly. The idea of moving out of Germany wasn't so popular in this very large headquarters site. But then policy came involved. BASF broke ground on its mega headquarters site. This, by the way, is 21 square kilometers along the Rhine in Ludwigshafen, Germany. It's the world's single largest manufacturing site. So in a little corner of this, they were building a big building to manufacture recombinant DNA-based tumor necrosis factor, which had not been approved, had shown no clinical efficacy, but they really liked this technology. And then the German government, in its wisdom, passed the gene gazettes, the gene law, which banned recombinant DNA-based manufacturing in Germany. So those scientists who've been visiting Biogen, Werner and Hans, don't need to know their last names, dusted off this proposal they had to open an R&D center in Cambridge or somewhere nearby, went to the BASF executive board and said, we're going to move our biotech recombinant DNA-based research out of Germany, which the research people on the board would have hated because it was competition, taking jobs out of Germany. But the guy responsible for policy loved it because he could tell the German government that the German government was local, but he was global, and if they banned it in Germany, he'd do it in the US. So that's the policy piece. So it was the fact that recombinant DNA technology, after a lot of kerfuffle and problems, was approved in Massachusetts towns, and it was more or less clear how you get approval to build such a center. Laws were in place, committees were in place, and Massachusetts wanted them. If you imagine a German company, chemical companies have trouble locating sites anyway. They're not necessarily welcomed everywhere in the world, and they want to build a site with a technology which is banned in Germany, and they come to Massachusetts and people like them. This was a big moment.
From my standpoint, I think Worcester was prepared. I thank the governor. I never got a chance to thank you for creating jobs there, one of which was with me, because I was one of the people Bob talked about who had no right to be working in an industry I knew nothing about. My background was as a CPA and an attorney. All of a sudden you're thrown into this world of science. What I was doing before that, you would have to go on Google, I think most of the people. We were making audio cassettes, video cassettes, 3.5-inch discs, which were new and fantastic. They could hold so much data. And but that was taking over from the 5.25.
3 megabytes?
Yeah, it was amazing. And then we had 5.25-inch discs before that had this exposed space that could easily get corrupted, and it was just horrible. So we came into this new field with 10 people, and they were pretty select on getting the right type of people over from Germany. Then they drew on people that were administrative in Massachusetts, and what you find out is that you've got to continue to evolve and learn. And before Fred asked me about it, I hadn't really stopped to think about the group that we had, Bob, that was cohesive, and then watching them over the time, being young and foolish, still old and foolish now, but in that period of time acquiring so much data and abilities to do so many different things. It was really, you don't stop and think about it while you're working on it. I think that's one of my messages. But adaptability is the key. When I was here, Frank Volpe, who started the Masters in Tax program, pulled me aside and he said, Bob, you really should be going to law school. And I said, well, I wanted to right out of college, but I had the great opportunity to be with Deloitte Touche, got some great experience with them, got married, had children relatively early, and then came here to get the master's degree, and he said, you really should. I said, what am I going to do with it? He says, it doesn't really matter. If you don't have it, it will preclude opportunities. If you do go forward and get that because you have great abilities in tax, which is law, the rest of it's going to be simple for you. So I did, and the rest, as I said, we were prepared, as Worcester was prepared, and they were prepared because they had all the regulations in place, Governor. And so that was a big thing with Germans with their checklist. We've got plenty of land, we can build a nice site, it can be something we own, we don't lease, and the regulations are already acceptable, whereas in Europe and Germany in particular, they weren't going to be acceptable. So.
Left out one important detail, which is kind of amusing. So in this presentation and subsequent decision by the BASF Executive Board, what the scientists asked for was $100 million in capital. Because if you know anything about the chemical industry, it's all about managing capital expenditures. They have this vast infrastructure of plants all over the world, with always expanding with repairs. And a company like BASF has a very sophisticated capital allocation process with commissions and decisions and hurdles. So if you want the executive board to be able to make a decision, you ask not for a concept, you ask for some money for capital investment. So they got approval for $100 million to build a building, which in 1989 was equivalent of, say, 700 million, something like that. So they decided that, and then they decided to delegate 6 young scientists, average age 28, to move to the US for a 3-year period and ask them to please build a biotech company. So the imbalance is really quite striking. $100 million to build a building, 6 young scientists with virtually no experience.
So, yeah, a little different than the average biotech, which starts out with the same people and no money at all, right? So you had many projects going on at BASF Bio, but the one that led to Humira pursued a technology which has turned out to be the most important class of drugs coming to market today, namely these human monoclonal antibodies. And that technology, there was some risk in making that choice, technical risk. This was a technology that had been around for 20 years. Much like the city of Worcester, the technology was kind of in the dumps and had lost some believers. And you made some key choices to make it work.
Yeah, I can give some background about why we decided to work, not primarily, but to focus on this field of human monoclonal antibodies. Before I took the job with BASF, I'd been for all of the 80s the head of R&D at one of the pioneering Cambridge biotech companies, which was called Genetics Institute, which was subsequently bought by American Home Products, which became Wyeth, which was bought by Pfizer. So if you look at the core scientific staff of Pfizer's new Kendall Square headquarters, it's people from Genetics Institute. Anyway, during the 1980s, Genetics Institute and Genentech on the West Coast figured out how to use this recombinant DNA technology to make therapeutics. And primarily we figured out how to clone genes and insert them into host cells and grow those host cells in big stainless steel tanks and make very complicated proteins on large scale. And the kind of projects we're working on were primarily replacement protein products. So the biggest success for Genetics Institute was factor VIII to treat hemophilia. Very easy to understand. Hemophilia A patients, this is the clotting disorder, this is the bleeding disease. The cause of the disease is these patients have a mutation in their factor VIII gene. They either don't make any factor VIII or they make not enough or it doesn't work. So to keep them from bleeding to death, you have to give them crude, at that time, crude products made from human plasma that contained factor VIII so they wouldn't bleed to death. And the simple idea was to use recombinant DNA technology, make factor VIII, give them a nice pure protein, and you wouldn't have to fractionate plasma. So we did that. It was a terrible project to work on. Factor VIII is a big, hairy, complicated molecule, very hard to make, but we did that. And we did other projects like that. But by the end of the 80s, we were running out of these replacement protein ideas. You know, we could make proteins, the technology worked. But we learned that the drug industry is based on making therapies for disease, which basically works that biochemists or other people figure out that this disease is caused by a problem in this enzyme pathway or a problem with this receptor. And then the chemist would make a small molecule drug that either activated it or blocked that pathway. So you start with a disease, you find out what the pathophysiology is, and then you make a drug to cure that disease. That's very different from factor VIII. You know, we could just make factor VIII, it was missing. And there was kind of a malaise in the biotech industry at the end of the 80s when I lost GI because finding new projects was very difficult. I realized, this is another story we won't have time to tell today, during 1989-90, that monoclonal antibodies were a different category of protein. Without going into the science, your body makes antibodies to fight infections, and through a miraculous bit of evolution, each one of you is probably at this time making about 10 to the 9th different antibodies. That's 1,000 billion, yeah. So a lot of different antibodies. And you can make an antibody which is a big protein that binds to another protein, and in general you can make an antibody that binds any protein. So I thought, aha, this is kind of interesting. If we could design antibodies to bind to any protein, we could beat out the chemists. Because if we had a disease where the disease was caused by a target, we could make an antibody to bind that target. That was the basic idea. And you'd have a whole new class of drugs, and the technology would be easy, it'd be wonderful. The only problem is that the technology in the 80s to make antibodies involved mice, shooting up mice with the target, and their immune system would make the antibody. Then you kill the mouse, take out the spleen, et cetera, and there's a whole process for making antibodies. Those antibodies ended up being mouse proteins. You inject them into people, patients. Patients would make antibodies against the antibodies, and they wouldn't work. So that whole technology kind of died. So the idea that I and probably a few other people had in 89, 90 was that if you could make human antibodies, maybe you could give them repeatedly to people. Maybe they would be no different from the other antibodies the patient was already making, and maybe they wouldn't be immunogenic. And that would be great because then we'd have lots of ideas. We could do projects for the next 30 years, just needed targets. So the concept when I joined BASF was to try to do a simple experiment, pick a good target, make a human antibody using the best technology available because the technology was evolving for doing that, and then see whether you could give it repeatedly to patients and treat a chronic disease. Simple idea. So we got together in Cambridge, there were 12 of us, thinking we've got all this money, what the hell are we going to do? And the people knew about TNF. We knew that TNF was a major player in inflammation and had assays set up, and I won't go through all the other details, but we decided, well, we'll make an antibody against TNF. It's probably be useful, we hope. And that was the beginning of the program. So it was meant to be a proof of principle to see whether you could give an antibody to patients repeatedly. It worked.
So that's the science side, but you also needed to do some business work to make these proteins.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is business. The finance and the legal parts of it were really intriguing. First of all, just a little bit more science background from my combined background as a CPA and an attorney. You don't make antibodies to human proteins. So when something is overexpressed in the body, your body doesn't make something. It fights off all foreign things that come in. So what Bob was able to do, if there's an overexpression that's in play and causes disease, like overexpression of TNF-alpha that causes inflammation, we're able to make a human antibody so it's not rejected by the body that will neutralize enough of it to bring it down to the level that everybody else has. So for finance people, that may not be obvious. For Bob and all of his colleagues, it'd be obvious that you don't make those. So it was novel in that regard. The hangover of the murine antibodies, the mouse antibodies, where the people thought anytime you gave an antibody to someone, you were going to have an immune response. And you're foolish enough to try to do this on a chronic disease. RA is progressive, degenerative, and relentless. Those are 3 words I heard in Japan that when I heard them, it was really, really staggering. They said that the quality of life, this is before Humira, before Enbrel and others, for people with RA was worse than for people with cancer. Because with cancer, if you're successful and the treatment is good, you may have a long period of time without any relapses and be very, very fine. I met so many patients, the patients told me that their life beforehand, one guy who started doing this, he goes, Bob, look, 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 look. I go, look at what? He says, I couldn't move my hand before I started getting on anti-TNF products. And he says, I was miserable. I was mean-spirited. He says, I can't tell you how it is. So anyways, that's a quick divergence, a little bit of science from the viewpoint of a CPA. But from a business standpoint, we ran into a lot of things, including numbers. One of the problems that we had built a beautiful facility in Worcester. When we built that facility, we had a product that needed the manufacturing space. I think it was Peg Huridan, Bob, that we were going to manufacture there. And it died on the vine. We had put together a very elite group of
failed in clinical trials, which is a common outcome.
Yeah, and so we had put together a very elite group of people to work on it. We had built a really first-class German-engineered system, which could also make beer if we find it through it. It's fermentation and purification, so just a tremendous facility.
Price might have been a bit prohibitive.
Price would have been prohibitive for the quality, though, would have been excellent. And then we had nothing to do with it. And so we're sitting there and we're saying, what can we do? We're going to end up losing all these people, and how are we ever going to rebuild the crew? So what we did instead, we went on the road and we took in other people's laundry. So other people that needed something to be manufactured, biomanufactured, we worked on. So we took from an accounting standpoint all of this overhead, which was a terrible drain, and turned it into one of the best assets that we could possibly have. It also allowed us to learn a lot of techniques, to develop a really good crew of the people at the real base level following standard operating procedures, et cetera, to get it up and running. Other things that we ran into was technology. The number of licenses we had to do, so not to be violating other people's patents, was just unbelievable. It was the nascent time for the industry. A lot of patents had been filed, many of which might have impinged on our manufacturing ability, et cetera. So we went out, we did an awful lot of licenses to back this up, and then at the tail end of it, there was a lot of litigation once it was approved, because just an awful lot of work to do. To get it through the regulatory process too, Bob, was just exceptional.
Let me add something to the business aspect. So I told part of the story that the 12 of us got together, decided we'd make an antibody against TNF using the best technology available. Problem was we didn't have any of the best technology available. It belonged to other biotech companies. So we started a process of talking to people in the biotech community who had interesting technology to see whether we could license it, collaborate, whatever, to basically buy the technology from them. And the key moment came 1991. I was at a conference in San Diego, and I ran into a guy named Dave Chiswell. I promised I'd mention names. So my academic career was in London. I was for 10 years working in the Cancer Research Institute in London. I had my own lab, my own group. Dave had been a postdoc, and we used to go out to the George pub behind the institute and drink together almost every evening. And I taught him how to do some technique, I forgot what it was. And he'd gone into industry, which was very strange, long before I did. So we ran into each other at this meeting and had lunch. And he said that he and a now very famous scientist named Greg Winter, he's now Sir Greg because of Humira, had started this company called Cambridge Antibody Technology. And they had this real sexy, fancy way of making human antibodies. But they didn't have any money. And they really needed a good partner. So I said, well, we're looking for an antibody technology. Let's do this together. He said, okay. Then I asked him, how much is this going to cost us? Because BASF has got a lot of money, but it's a little bit cheap. And they've never done a biotech deal except the Biogen deal. It didn't work out well. So this might be difficult. And he said over lunch, okay, we'll start making the antibody. We'll work collaboratively with you guys. We'll set up a joint research team. If we succeed, you pay us 600,000 pounds. If we don't succeed, you don't pay us anything. So I was pretty excited about that. It was a pretty sporting proposition, not much risk. There were some milestones and some royalties downstream, but by contemporary standards, this was really dirt cheap. And with that background, and then almost 18 months or 2 years of lawyering, we eventually had a deal with Cambridge Antibody Technology. The scientists actually started working 12 months before the deal was signed because we didn't want to waste time. But talking about people, Dave and I knew each other. I knew Greg. We ran into each other by accident and did the deal basically over lunch because of the previous personal connection. And that's something to really be aware of as you move forward in life. Little lunchtime meetings, meeting a colleague at a dinner or a cocktail party, you can put together something really pretty important.
So a couple of points about the industry worth pointing out here, particularly for the students. Notice it's the business people who decide that there has to be a little more science on the table, and it's the scientists who end up telling the business story. It's always like that.
It's all one team.
It's always like that, and it's a really important demonstration. You guys couldn't have. This happens at every meeting in every company. The other is the central place of food, right? We've had references to beer at least twice, and networking, and the informal networking and the speaking languages. So you signed an alliance with Cambridge Antibody Tech. At the end of the day, they received, they would get a royalty on the sales of the product, which you spent some of the last 10 years working on. And you had the team that now put this into clinical trials and began to focus on demonstrating whether the product had activity, whether it was safe, and figuring out what you might use it for.
We created this joint research team to make a fully human antibody. Nobody had ever done that in the laboratory before. We actually made this, molecular biologists with their hands pipetting into little tubes, little microliter amounts of liquid, and made this protein. And Cambridge Antibody Technology had invented the system, but they'd never gotten it to work. So probably the smartest thing I did in the beginning of the project was to ask this young molecular biologist named Jochen Saalfeld, who was one of these 12 people. He was a German, but he'd been hired out of Harvard Medical School locally, whether he would head up this program. And Jochen supervised the research, supervised the transition into the clinic, handled a lot of the business aspects and a lot of the patent aspects, and is today, 30 years later, head of biologics for AbbVie. He's still there. Get a little emotional. He's a wonderful guy. If I would have picked the guy sitting next to him in the meeting, I don't know what would have happened. It's all about people. So the technology, we pulled off, their technology turned out not to work. We had to together invent a better way of doing it, a variant. It took 2 years of almost brute force of a transatlantic team meeting by phone every Friday. There were about 10 people outside of Cambridge, UK, and about 6 to 8 people in Cambridge and in Worcester. And eventually we had a molecule we called D2E7. and then had to figure out how to take it to the clinic.
So, so when it's in the clinic, there are 3 stages. You figure out sort of how to administer it first, so-called phase 1. Phase 2 is, and you look at safety, can you give this without side effects? Phase 2, you begin to give it in a situation where it may help people, you're looking for positive effects. And then you do large studies in phase 3 for very specific clinical reasons, and then you go to the government for approval based on those data. And you chose to look at rheumatoid arthritis, rheumatic disease as a indication.
Yeah, let me explain that part of the story. So we started this program pretty confident that TNF was a nasty player, and we had some data, and there were other academic groups that had some data, suggesting it was involved in a whole list of autoimmune diseases. RA was on the top because it's the most severe, it's the most prevalent, but there are a whole list of other ones, some acute, some chronic. And we didn't really have any guidance. There was no demonstration of any clinical efficacy of blocking TNF and showing benefit to patients. And then in 1994, I think it is, Dan Tracy, who had joined our team from the Upjohn Company, he was actually an immunologist, the first immunologist we hired. He went to a Keystone meeting in, which is one of these skiing meetings in Colorado, and he heard a presentation from a clinical rheumatologist, a clinical immunologist named Mark Feldman, who was another one of my former colleagues from my days in London. And Mark had done a clinical study with some borrowed anti-TNF antibody from Centocor. I'm not sure they ever really approved the study. He'd gotten it, let's say, off the back of the truck. I can't go into the details. But he's a great visionary. I said it wrong. He was a cellular immunologist, very theoretical, who'd taken a job in a major rheumatology clinic because he wanted to apply his immunology to curing rheumatoid arthritis. And he had mounted a program first testing agents in mice. He had good data in mice. He wanted to test an anti-TNF in people. He got this failed drug from Centocor, which is now Remicade, and tried it in 22 people, and 18 got remarkably better. So Dan Tracy was at this meeting. He phoned me up after the session and said, "We've got our indications. Blocking TNF works in RA." And then I called up our clinical people and said, we're going to make a RA drug. But we had the advantage that Feldman teamed up with Centocor that had given him the test agent, and they got the product that became Remicade into the clinic well before we did. So by the time we were ready to start clinical trials, there were 2. There was Remicade and what became Enbrel, who were about 2 years ahead of us. And one of the things I've learned in the pharma business, being innovative is good, but it's also kind of risky because you don't know what the hell to do. If you're the first in a class, you have to design the clinical protocol. You got to get investigators excited. You can make mistakes. Being number 2 or 3, being 2 years behind, particularly if you have the best-in-class agent, is pretty good because you just do what the other guys did, which is not a bad way to proceed in life. So we actually didn't have to do a traditional phase 1 in volunteers. It was known that anti-TNFs work. So we went into patients. And the whole development was streamlined by the fact that we already knew the kind of studies to get involved. And in fact, Huffman LaRoche had a product which failed for reasons that I won't go into. And we were able to recruit their investigators to do our study because they were frustrated that they couldn't continue their work. So Humira is very much an example of a best-in-class drug, which is the 3rd to be approved, but ends up taking market share because it has some key advantages and wins the battle at the end.
Fred, could I ask a question to both of you? As you were going through this process, where was the public sector? I mean, we had tried to kind of prepare the way with Worcester, but I assume there were federal regulatory hurdles that you had to deal with? How did that
Well,
work?
you know, the whole recombinant DNA-based therapeutic product, which we now call biologics, development cycle, the regulations and the FDA approval is pretty slick. So of course the manufacturing site had to be inspected, had to be approved. There are very complicated regulations. That's a process which is difficult but works. The clinical trials are done through the FDA, which is a much maligned but wonderful organization manned by scientist administrators, or clinical scientists, clinical people. They were very supportive. I'll tell you one anecdote. One of the things we had in the back of our minds, of course, was safety. You know, could you give an anti-TNF safely? And one of the things we were sort of worried about was tuberculosis, because TNF is involved in controlling tuberculosis. It was very much in the back of our minds until the German subsidiary reported they had 5 cases of relapsed TB in the first study. And by the way, they didn't know the FDA regulation that you have to report any adverse event within 6 weeks, and they were 7 weeks out. So we had to assemble the data, file the data with the assigned FDA reviewer. There's one guy who we knew pretty well, and ask him what to do. And he could have put us on clinical hold, which would have basically killed the program. He said, I'll give you a week. You come up and tell me what you're going to do, and if I'm happy with that proposal, I won't put you on clinical hold, you can go ahead. So we knew nothing about TB, so we pulled this crisis committee together, pulled in TB experts, came up with a good plan. I won't go through the plan. And then called up this guy, whose name I've forgotten now, unfortunately, but one man, one individual, and said, can we have a meeting? He said, okay, 7 o'clock Friday evening. My day is busy, I'll talk to you at 7 o'clock after work from home. So we had a group of people in a hotel room in New Jersey, all these experts, and Steve Fishkoff, the clinician in charge, had to get this FDA guy on the phone, explain the mediation plan very carefully while we were protecting patients, we wouldn't endanger anyone. The guy listened and he said, okay, go ahead. That's remarkable for a federal agency. They could have, come down on us like a ton of bricks. But the FDA wants drugs out to help patients. What they're controlled with, what they're most concerned with is you're doing experiments, clinical trials on people, and they've got to control the fact that you don't damage the people. They don't want you to start treating people in the US and have 50 cases of TB. So that was his concern, but he wanted to move the program along. It's one anecdote. But the FDA does a great job, and now in oncology, I'm involved in new startup oncology companies. They're just remarkable. They'll give you all the support you need to speed the development of breakthrough drugs.
The other thing we had locally, not at the federal level, is we started to become successful. We started with only 89 people in a 500,000 square foot building, but we, like a new family, we ran out of space. And so at the local level, on 2 occasions, I went to the city manager, the city council, and the mayor, and got 2 different tax incentive financing programs, which were really well thought out. You were required to sit there and talk about the additional employment that you might have as a result of this. You required on an annual basis to report out what you actually did, and we got a 15-year deferral on the real estate taxes and personal property taxes that would be occasioned by this additional space. Couldn't have had better people to work with the city. At the state level, we got a number of other things that also worked out well. Did our annual reporting to the DOR, got very good results. A lot of times you hear, oh yeah, they're giving away tax money. What we did, we created economic opportunity for a lot of great people. Many of them were still there 20 years later, some of which came through a very creative program for unwed mothers that was funded by the federal government. They came in and worked as interns for us, and I know of 2 of them that are still there 20 years later. It was progressive, it was creative, and it was successful.
I think the other issue for policy, which I want to be sure we have time for, at the end is you were going for about 14 years, 13 years with no revenues from this product. So this is being supported from non-revenue sources, non-Humira revenue sources the whole time. But before you could get to revenues, you had one more big step here.
Supported by
You had to
BASF.
get this to market. And you chose at this point not to do this internally, but to, your company was acquired.
Yeah, let's talk about the history of that.
Yeah.
So developing D2E7 through the BASF pharma system was a struggle. There was limited backing for immunology as a therapeutic area, very limited understanding of rheumatoid arthritis. The daughter companies, the sales and marketing companies, had no presence in rheumatology. So this wasn't, a big popular project. It got saved at one point by a consulting program from the Wilkerson Group. They came and did a site audit, and Jochen Saalfeld presented D2E7, the clinical data, and Wilkerson Group had hired an English guy who was a biotech expert, and he was amazed, and he reported to senior management his amazement that this wasn't the number one priority in the program, in the whole company. So we got some external support, but in 1995 or 6, when we were looking for internal funding, I think for the phase 2 program, at that time we were organized by therapeutic area with a very nice combination of R&D, sales, and marketing. So I co-headed the therapeutic area with a guy named Michael Martin, who was a commercial guy. We didn't have any products yet, but we were preparing. So Michael and I guess some other person made the pitch to this committee, whatever the committee was called at the time, which controls the budget, chaired by the CEO of the pharma division. So we proposed our plan and the budget, and we were told it's fine. We approved the plan, it's an excellent plan. You also proposed budgets for other oncology products in your portfolio. You've got a budget, you handle it. No more money. So Michael and I went out of the room. It was again in a hotel in New Jersey for some reason. We went to an adjoining room and we talked, and we came back in and said, oncology's dead. We're going to kill all the oncology programs. We'll take the responsibility to monetize that. Later we hired a guy named Al Collinson, local Massachusetts guy, Rhode Island actually. He sold the oncology portfolio for $65 million, cash up front. We used that to fund the phase 2. There was no money internally available. That was just one anecdote. It was not easy moving this through BASF Pharma. Money was not falling from trees. So I was pushing all along for partnering this. The idea, we were number 3, we had an advantage, but number 3 with no money for launch is dead. So we started in a partnering process, and that ended up being an acquisition.
And we went through a long and involved deals in terms of seeking out a partner who had the right background that we could have. We met with every major pharma. We selected one which still, I believe, is covered under confidentiality. We negotiated full agreements with them and were ready to run, and then you stepped in again.
Yeah, so this was 1999 or 2000. D2E7, it wasn't called Humira yet, was in phase 3. It was very promising. We had this fully negotiated deal with a major pharma company for $200 million up front to buy 3 years of half the US market. It would have been the biggest licensing deal ever done. Pharma certainly appreciated the value of an advantage Me3. The accountants can calculate the value. And the execution risk, it's just execution risk. The clinical trials are going to work. There's some minor probability. So I at the same time was talking about my unit, BASF Bioresearch, with the number 2 guy in BASF, a guy named Egert Fascherau, who'd been my mentor helping me integrate into the BASF megalopolis. Because I had wanted him to spin off BASF Bioresearch and merge it with a US biotech company. So at this point, since if we signed this deal, the value would have been gone and my spin-off ideas would have failed, I called him up and told him about this, and he said, come over and have lunch. This was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I got in a cab and went to the airport, flew to Germany, had lunch with this fellow in beautiful executive dining room on the BASF site, and tell him the story. And I won't go through all the details, but he tells me, we've been trying to sell this pharma division for 3 years. Nobody wants to buy the thing at a decent value. I'm going to change my strategy. I'm going to sell an American biotech company with a blockbuster in the pipeline. He had the validation of the value. I don't think he understood the value. Would you be willing to meet with some investment bankers next week? So what was going on? BASF had decided strategically pharma didn't fit with chemicals. They wanted to monetize the pharma division. They weren't getting any bites above about $3 billion, which they thought was much too little for a medium-sized German pharma company. So we conducted an auction that took 3 or 4 months out of London to sell an American biotech company, BASF Bioresearch in Worcester, Mass., which, by the way, had a 10,000-person medium-sized German company behind it and $3 billion in sales and 10,000 people. But Abbott, at the end, stepped up. It's another personal story. Abbott Pharma had just been taken over by Jeff Leiden. People know Jeff Leiden. He's now the CEO of Vertex. Jeff had, at about that time, been recruited out of the Harvard School of Public Health, where he's a professor, to become the head of the pharma division of Abbott Laboratories. He had no business experience. He took the job with the idea that they would make a major acquisition. He tasked his business development group in Abbott to find him an acquisition, and a guy named James Gorman, who's a Wellesley native and is now back in the biotech community, suggested they should go after D2E7 and BASF Pharma. And they made the best bid. They told us that they wanted a Boston area biotech site, that they would ring fence the Worcester site. Not only that, they would double our budget. So I would promote the deal. And they paid $6.8 billion to get BASF Bioresearch, Humira, and the rest of the product pipeline.
And from my standpoint, I had worked out all these agreements, co-manufacturing, co-development, co-commercialization on a global basis with this wonderful company. We had nailed it all down. Papers were about this thick. And then Bob came in and said, well, why don't you just throw those out? And so we did, but the results were
Not quite. We said, the instruction was, please tell those nice people in blank.
Blank.
The terms have changed.
Yep.
For $10 billion, they can have the division.
Right. And so we then went with John Conway, a phenomenal patent person, and I ended up doing being available for due diligence for all the people that wanted to acquire it. And because this was a great phase 3 asset, every major person came to meet with us in New York. We had to go from one location to another, so the business development people, because we meet morning and afternoon with 2 different people, had to go from different locations to make sure that the people didn't run into each other and know that everybody was all bidding on the same thing to try to get the best bid. So we went through all of that process, and then I got a call and says, you have to go back to New York on Monday. I don't hate New York, but I don't love New York, and traveling there is not always that much fun. So I said, sure, let's go back. Who are we going to meet with? And they said, a company called Abbott. And I said, my limited understanding, they don't have much in the way of biologics, but they're interested, and surely they were. And then behind the scene, Bob knew who the players were and what they were interested in. They came in, they worked incredibly fast, incredibly diligently, and they were behind on the timing of it because they came later to the gate, but they really worked at a tremendous pace. Very, very thorough, detailed, and I think reasonable.
And also talking about people, so Jeff, he's a cardiologist, but his research field is immunology, and in the late 80s he'd done some consulting for Genetics Institute. So, you know, important things happen between people who have some connections. And the acquisition, you often hear bad stories about acquisitions. Abbott did a remarkable job. And under Jeff's leadership, he told everybody in this pretty big Chicago, Abbott is based in Chicago, very Midwestern, they'd never done anything on the East Coast, but very open people, not competitive. he told the company that there is a priority for Abbott Laboratories Pharmaceutical Division to get Humira approved and make this a major product, and everything else is 10 times less important. So they just ganged on. Everybody offered help. When we filed the application for approval, I asked Jochen Saalfeld, who was still the leader of the whole thing, how many people are on the project team? And he went away and then came back later and said, I just counted, there are 629 people on the project team. I've never heard of a team that large in the pharma company, but Leiden had said that Abbott's future depended upon everything being smooth and getting this launch, this approval from the FDA and the launch proper, and they went all out and succeeded.
So I want to fast forward to the end game here, so we have time for Bob Coughlin. And Humira was approved, and over the years has been approved not only for
4:30 in the afternoon, December 31st, 2002, by the same guy who was on the phone. The approval happens by a fax, a letter. So the Office of Biologics of the FDA was going out of existence that day. The guy who'd been shepherding the program had lost his job. If he didn't approve it, who knows what would have happened? It would have gone to a new agency. So the people in New Jersey were waiting. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the end of the year, this fax comes. I saw it's just a little letter, which with some gobbledygook legalese language, saying you could market the product.
a late Christmas at best.
Yeah.
So before you were done, Abbott had spent at least $6.9 billion
Yeah.
to buy you. After that, Abbott was running a team of at least 650 people for a number of years to bring this over the line. And the drug has been approved for probably almost 8 or 9 different indications since, each of which expands the market, in that the current market of the 16 billion a year is approved for, I think, 8 or 9 different diseases. We had the list up earlier. So that the total investment in this is in the billions. And part of the being a $16 billion drug is pricing. And this now comes really probably the hottest policy issue to come full circle to policy. This is a drug that changes lives. If you want to see how this changes lives, I did this last night. I went to drugs.com and read the customer reviews. I've never done that before. And drugs have side effects. All drugs have side effects. But to read how this changes lives, but at a price. And I just was wondering if, to really introduce Bob, you'd want to comment from your work on health policy. How do we balance the public benefits that this provided to Worcester, to the people involved, to the patients, with a drug that list price, not what anyone pays, is probably about $40,000 a year.
At list price that hardly anyone pays.
Yeah, no one pays the $40,000, but that's about the list price.
Which, by the way, would be helpful in this debate, because nobody really knows, at least us laymen don't understand what's going on. Well, it really doesn't cost 40. There are discounts, who gets them. I mean, that's part of the confusion, I think, Bob, in terms of the public understanding of this.
Yeah.
Now, look, every other healthcare system in the world basically controls the price of drugs. I think we're the only one that doesn't. Maybe wrong. Bob, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But by and large, prices are controlled generally in these other healthcare systems. That includes drugs. And I'm not, and they approach this in very different ways. I think the challenge, and Bob, I hope you'll talk to this, the challenge is to come up with a framework in which we obviously want to encourage this kind of thing. I mean, the numbers are huge. But at the same time, deal with the wise guys. And unfortunately, we've got some wise guys out there. Yeah. And I'd rather listen to Bob talk about this, but I don't think the current system is tolerable. You know, you can't keep having these food fights every time somebody comes along and takes a drug and jacks it by 6 times with no apparent constructive investment at that point.
Yeah, but we should point out that this is very much in the public eye, but this is not the pricing policy of established pharma companies. These are these wise guys, it's specialized companies that, so they're two separate pricing things. There are these small companies who are, reprehensible. I don't think anyone really supports EpiPen, that stuff. But then there's this real policy issue of the major research-based pharma companies and the whole biotech industry that they support through partnering that have economic problems because they have tremendous R&D costs, they have tremendous marketing costs. Right. When they get a big drug like Humira, they dump all these costs onto the profit from that. And how to deal with that, how to reduce those costs. And sure, we pay more for drugs here than they do in Europe because they have more government regulation and pricing. But if we did the same thing here, we would kill the industry because it's the profits out of the U.S. that's driving the innovation.
So I think
it's a very difficult policy issue.
You guys have heard a lot of the pieces, number of failed compounds came up in the discussion today, the acquisitions, the people in the community. So with that, I'd like to bring Bob Coughlin up and give him my chair. And we've asked Bob to sort of summarize for about 15 minutes sort of some of these points with a focus on the biotechnology industry today and the future. And as the president and CEO of the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council, I can't think of anybody, and a former legislator, anyone who has a bigger view of all this.
No, thank you, Fred. How about a big round of applause for Fred, huh? What a great guy. And to all you students here, all right, what's the first year in the timeline? 89, 88? You want to know what I was doing in 1989? I was sitting in a class like this. So this is, it was my sophomore year at Mass Maritime Academy, and I never thought I'd be sitting here with these guys. So to you students out there, you can do anything you want. There's so much hope. Nobody ever thought I'd make it. And I have the best job in biotechnology and the best place in the world for biotechnology. And a lot of it I have to thank to you three gentlemen. Governor Dukakis is the person that made me want to get into politics. Because when I was at Mass Maritime Academy, I had to go to his office one day and have an interview because I was running to be the student member of the Board of Regents of Higher Education. It's now known as the Board of Higher Education. And I had to interview with him and convince him why I would be the right person for the job. And I said, well, Governor, your sister-in-law, Mrs. Shane, taught me how to read. She was my kindergarten teacher at the Green Lodge School in Dedham, Massachusetts. And I got it. I don't know if that was the reason, Governor, but
Bob, that was the reason.
Oh, see? All right, don't tweet that, folks, all right? This is off the record.
Without Ginny, you'd have never made it.
She's the best. She's the best. She taught me how to read, so could you tell her I'm doing okay?
I will.
And then I got involved, when I graduated from the academy, I had this love for politics. I ended up running for the school committee in my town while I was still in college, and I got elected, and that made me take a job that meant that I couldn't ship out in the merchant marine. So I went to go work for this little teeny startup environmental company called Clean Harbors Environmental Services.
That's right.
I'm the living example that every once in a while a blind squirrel can find a nut, all right? Because one of my first biggest clients was BASF.
Really?
Right.
And the hazardous waste that I was pulling out of there.
We had some litigation on a refrigeration system that were called ice balls.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah,
and so
it paid for my house.
Bob told me that his wife loved me very much, although she had never met me.
Yeah.
Because their family had expanded, and the work he did for us, because he found an inexpensive way to do it, I made the people who brought the things in pay for it. And they paid Bud directly, and he put an addition on his house. So it's very incestuous.
Yeah.
And that goes back.
I decided.
But that's the way everything in the world is. Now, this is just an example.
It really is.
It's all about the network.
And this really is a remarkable example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of personal relationships, folks, that end up
Just remember that.
doing great things.
And many of them start when they're your age, the people you're sitting next to. Treasure those relationships.
And it was the enjoyment that I had in government that I found I enjoyed more than my professional career at Clean Harbors, so I decided to leave the private sector, and I ran for selectman in my town, did that for a bunch of years, and then ran for the legislature. And when I was running for the legislature, something happened personally that really got me into this industry. My wife and I were having our third child, and we found out in utero that at 21 weeks that this little baby was going to have a disease called cystic fibrosis. And while I was in the legislature, I worked real hard as a policy person. And that's what we're going to talk about when we surmise here, is that working in policy to create a climate so that the Genetics Institute, Integrated Genetics, Biogen, BASF, then Abbott, then AbbVie, and all
Vertex.
these companies, and Vertex, obviously, yeah, Vertex is a wonderful example. We need to work in policy to create a climate so that these companies could innovate. For me, I felt that I could utilize my skills and talent and passion as a legislator, and I see my former colleague from the House, Kevin O'Sullivan, who also got into the biotech industry. We would work to make Massachusetts good so that we could find cures for sick people. Fast forward through that, what I learned about raising money with the CF Foundation and investing in companies like Vertex, Foldirex, Combinatorix, Epic, Altus, Alnylam, Alnara, a bunch, I learned personally how difficult it was to buy a cure for my own kid. He was in 6 clinical trials before he was 6 years old, and I realized that the FDA wasn't the easiest to work with. The things that we can do better. So now you say, okay, in 1985, MassBio was founded. MassBio was founded because of exactly the opportunity that we took advantage of here. The folks in Cambridge didn't know what the definition of genetic engineering was. MassBio was founded by those charter companies to educate city councilors in Cambridge as to what genetic engineering meant. It's now known as Biotech. They had to go across the river to educate legislators and folks in the administration as to what this industry could be in the future. And this case study paved the way. And when you think about what, to summarize, you had government. Governor Dukakis set the bar for what we were going to do in this industry. It was brand new. In 1985, MassBio was founded as the first biotech trade association in the world. Now we're the biggest and the best. And I'm not going to take credit for all of that. It's a collaborative effort, right? You can take the guy out of politics, but he still takes credit for stuff, right, Governor? And when you look at what Governor Dukakis did by saying, hey, we're open for business. We're going to do this. It doesn't have to be in Cambridge, folks. We have biotech clusters all over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they're amazing. They're amazing. We have a high concentration of R&D, science going on in Cambridge, but when you go further down that business cycle, like you heard here, from beginning to inpatient, bench to bedside, we sprawl all across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The governor talked about where policy plays a role. Bob talked about people, having the right people on the team, the right ideas, and you also talked about opportunity. Germany wasn't getting it right. That is opportunity, folks. And we're going to talk about that.
And they still haven't. The German government has tried to foster biotech repeatedly, and it's still much less successful than the quality of their science would lead you to expect.
And that's okay, you know, because we will capitalize on that. And when you also talked about breakthrough, you weren't looking to make a Me Too drug. You weren't looking to make another version of something that existed. You were doing something new. You were pioneering. You were using large molecules to help people with a debilitating disease. And that's hard. I love the points that you made about how it's not easy being the first because of the regulatory pathways, et cetera, and the challenges that you meet. We're going to talk a little bit more about when we discuss what's next, because we're facing that now with gene therapy, diagnostics, precision medicine, where we're going next. And you know, Bob, you talked about the business aspect of it. All of you folks, I mean, if you think of go to the massbio.org and look at the careers page, like the minute you graduate, you all can have jobs in this industry. Okay, it's not all scientists. 40% of the jobs out there are the business of biotech, communications, HR, accounting, finance, et cetera. There isn't a better industry to work in. And Bob, you talked about pulling the right people together. It's business and science working together. You can have the best scientists in the world doing one thing, and it's not going to get to the bedside. You can have all the business people in the world. If there's no science, it's not going to work either. So now, I mean, how about a big round of applause for all these guys for getting it done? The governor, we talk about what's next, okay? What's next? Value is a huge issue, okay? First and foremost, any patient that's suffering from these debilitating diseases, whether it's arthritis, cystic fibrosis, Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS, any type of cancer, there isn't a person in this room that doesn't know or love somebody who has died from an unmet medical need or currently suffering from an unmet medical need. So first and foremost, we do this for the patients, okay?
Yep.
Now value is under question. And Governor, you couldn't be right, and the Bobs, you talked about this. We have a lot of Bobs
Three
here,
Bobs.
right? And the value is under question because people don't understand certain things. We have a presidential race going on. It's a perfect storm right now. Presidential candidates are saying things that they need to say to get elected, okay? The reality is these drugs do bring value and avoid cost in our healthcare system, but we don't have a way of accounting for it. The second piece is you have folks like Martin Shkreli in Turing that take a 50-year-old drug or however old the drug was that was only one manufacturer of this generic drug. Generic drugs are supposed to be inexpensive. These companies that make branded drugs only have 14 years for a pill before it goes generic. You have 12 years for a large molecule biologic before it goes to a biosimilar. When those price drops to the generic, that creates the headroom to introduce new innovative products to the system. We don't want to have the same drugs as we've had 10, 15, 20 years ago. The United States of America and the people in this industry, we invent the new drugs. Okay, so you need to create that headspace. When you have somebody who takes a generic drug and ups the price by 3,000–4,000% like that, it ruins the whole equation. It ruins everything, but people don't understand that that's the generic industry. It's not the branded pharma drug industry. So there's things that we've done down in Washington, D.C. to fix that. We're working with our national delegation in Congress to make sure that the FDA has the resources to bring online generic manufacturers quicker. So if there's competition, if there are 3 or 4 other people making that drug that Martin Shkreli scouted out and bought and up the price, the competitive market would keep it at a competitive price, but there's no competition there. So we're fixing that.
Bob, let me interrupt, because unfortunately I've got to go back and sit down with a flock of graduate students this afternoon to talk about their major work they're doing for me, so I'm going to have to leave you. But just to comment on this, it took me a while to figure this out, and a defeat, frankly, before I went back to the governor's office. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether this is happening, I hope it is, but this is another classic case, folks, of where if people in the public sector and folks in the industry who are responsible sit down together, and I hope that's happening,
It is.
although there's a lot of fireworks out there. 99 times out of 100, in my experience, Bob, you can work out a solution that recognizes the importance of the kind of investment that we've just heard about and gets the wise guys out of the game.
That's
And
right.
I'm not sure, I hope it's happening, I'm not sure it is or will until the election's over. But it's remarkable, folks, when people sit down together
Yeah.
and have a thoughtful discussion about these kinds of things, how in many, many cases you can find an answer. And I mean, you're telling us it's happening. I hope it's happening.
Well, it's happening here in Massachusetts because we're fortunate where government, academia, industry works closely together. We also have some real innovative, great payers here. I'm friendly with the folks at Blue Cross and Harvard Pilgrim and Tufts, and we actually are having this dialogue because the reality is, and when you hear this term cost avoidance, think about it. We have invented a cure for hepatitis C, okay? Pre-rebate and discounts, it's an $80,000 a year drug. It's probably closer to $30,000 a year. It cures hepatitis C. People feel that that's too expensive. Think of the costs avoided. You avoid liver transplant. You put people back to work. You avoid death. It actually saves the chronic treatment for cirrhosis and hep C could cost a patient millions upon millions of dollars by the time they die. Now, that all goes away. But we don't have a system that will account for it. Right. When we meet with the payers,
And of course,
they say,
these hepatitis C treatments are curative,
Right.
and because of adjustments in the blood supply, there aren't any new hepatitis C patients, very few.
That's right.
So from the industry point of
You're
view,
eliminating disease.
they've developed drugs which will eliminate the disease. There's a 3-year period, and then there's no more market.
I have just one suggestion, and then I'm going to get out of here, because I have academic, I teach full-time, folks, no fooling around. You got to do something about this discount thing. It's totally confusing.
Yeah.
Filing legislation for transparency on rebate and discounts this session.
Rebates, discounts, more standard pricings, I don't know what
Yep.
you do. I mean, you guys know a lot more about this than I do, but it's totally confusing to those fellows out here trying to figure out what's going on.
Yep.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
so I got to leave you.
How about a big round of applause for the governor?
Thanks. Good to see you, pal. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
again, Governor.
Thank you.
My best to Mr. Shan.
Thank you. I'll be talking to Christine. Her husband, of course.
Great, so we're going to do questions and answers, but thank you so much, Governor, for joining us
Thanks so much.
today.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And glad to see you out. I want to, before I forget, and we have some students, and actually I have to,
I'm following a guy who I taught at Northeastern, and who is now a terrific member of the faculty at this university, and I'm very proud to lead. So,
thank you, Rob. So before I forget, I want to thank a couple of people, and then we'll take questions. One is Rob Schultz, in the first row here. Rob is an adjunct in our marketing department and active in the biotech industry, who has been writing a case study on everything we're hearing today, which we hope will get out soon, and really put this panel together. Or also in our group, Corey Blanchard and Danielle Soler, working with the Health Thought Leadership Network, took care of this and the luncheon that follows, which I hope people will stay for, where we'll continue this conversation. So I actually would like to, Rob Coughlin, let you continue the conversation you were having. And then we'll take questions from the audience.
We need to develop a system so that we can absorb new therapies into our payer system. What's next? I mean, you heard the story of Humira. We're working on companies, and Bob's on the board of a company that's a leader in gene therapy, right? How are we going to pay for gene therapy that is a cure? It's a one-time treatment. A payer, for them to pay for that cure up front, they typically only manage the cost associated with the patient for a year at a time. So why would they want to pay for the cure up front and then have a person bounce from plan to plan every 3 years? Typically, people go to a different plan. So we need a better system, because as we invent new innovative therapies, and I use Kalydeco and Orkambi as an example from Vertex. Vertex spent, I don't know, about $3 or $4 billion to invent drugs. Kalydeco is a drug that works for about 4% of the CF population. It costs $300,000 a year. Doesn't work for my kid. They invented a second drug, Orkambi. Now they're at about 50% of the CF population. Still doesn't work for one of the mutations that my son has. The reality is that $300,000 med sounds expensive up front. My kid who isn't on those new meds, he gets chest PT every day, takes about 100 pills every day to digest food. He does 3 separate nebulized. He's got a PICC line in to go in for cleanouts, which is a 10 to 18-day hospitalization stay. Very expensive, and he's just recently gone on the liver transplant list. He needs a liver transplant because he's got cystic fibrosis-associated liver disease as well. That's going to cost a lot of money. Long story short, my kid isn't on therapy, which people will say is expensive. He costs $500,000 a year now. If he goes on those drugs that work, the hospitalizations go away. The liver transplant would have gone away. You replace other therapies, but we don't have an accounting. That's why it's so exciting to see so many accounting type people here, right? We don't have an accounting system that can track costs avoided. And I tell our folks that are working in the gene therapy space, we need to fix this problem now, because gene therapy will be a reality, folks, and you will be able to cure disease and change how people's bodies react. I mean, I'm not the scientist here, but the reality is we need to have a system that will pay for it and really track costs avoided as a result of those new therapies.
And also the real value. When I trained in pediatrics in the late 70s, early 80s, the average life expectancy for a child born with cystic fibrosis was in the 10, 12-year range. And in the ensuing 20 years, that's gone up almost a year per year with traditional medicines, things that aren't the blockbusters that Vertex has developed. And to be able to continue to serve those children, now adults, that's a value that doesn't always show up on your balance sheets in the accounting classes.
Life.
But life has totally changed for these children and will continue in the past. So there are a couple of mics out there. If people have questions, if you just raise your hand, we'll run a mic over to you. Somebody, we have one in the middle here.
Hi, I really enjoyed the conversation today, so thank you. I've been in the biotech pharmaceutical industry for almost 30 years, and I can tell all the students here there is not a more exciting industry to be involved in, and been through much of this evolution. I worked at Vertex for 10 years on their InCivic program for telaprevir, and I worked very early stage in development as a business person. I was a strategic marketer there, and then later medical affairs. Mr. Anderson, can you talk about how in the early stages of development, a business person gets involved in drug development?
I think that a variety of factors where I got involved. I had the benefit of doing legal and finance, and so I thought that there wasn't much that I didn't know that was going on. I think the number one thing I had to do is to do I called myself a Renaissance accountant, which sounds rather counterintuitive.
Sounds exciting.
It's really even hard to just even say it, but you can become one of those people, trust me. What I did is I ended up reading a lot about science. When we got into the antibody field, I got a whole bunch of different books on antibodies, because in order to structure a deal, we had a really groundbreaking deal on BCL2 inhibitors. And so that was because we were working so hard on Humira, so maybe this is a good example. We didn't have the resources within AbbVie to handle the product ourselves, so we went to a wonderful company, Genentech, to negotiate with them. And what you really had to understand is, what were you giving up? What were you keeping? It is when they say the devil is in the detail, it's clearly in the details in the contract, in the agreements, in the negotiations. I had a phrase that I used all the time in negotiations. I would tell everybody, from a family of 6, and so I would say, well, I'm always very reasonable. And they were very pleased, and I said, as long as I get my way. And the way that I would get that is because, as Bob was saying, relationships are really paramount. When you're striking a deal, if it's not a fair deal, you'll be judged by that on the reputation. So from a very early standpoint, all the deals that we were doing, we're really trying to do inordinately fair, so that people would know what their rights, duties, responsibilities, and payoffs might be. So I think being involved, we were very unique in that we were in Cambridge initially, and we had really small space, and so we were all like on top of each other. So we liked each other. It was a young group of people that didn't really know how to run one of these companies, but all of a sudden we were thrown into it and took it seriously. And then from there, we kind of learned that each other was important. Jochen Saalfeld, who Bob talked about, is absolutely a wonderful person, did not like to negotiate at all. But I was in a car with him coming back from New Jersey, where our headquarters were, and he went through a whole litany. He didn't know his own phone number, so the person had to call my cell phone, and then he went through a whole patent estate saying why it was defective and why we didn't infringe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you learn that so many people have expertise. Your portion of it is important, but you really have to understand a lot more about the science side in order to be effective, I think, and become a Renaissance accountant.
Other questions?
I think this has been a great discussion, and with all the history, it's great to learn from all the speakers. My question is, I've been in the pharma, biotech, medical device industry for 20 years, and I think one of the things that comes up, because the market has changed in terms of, is really the cost. You know, Bob, you talk about cost avoidance. So what can the industry do in terms of making people more aware, not just the people in the industry, but people everywhere in terms of the lay people, because there's so much misconception in terms of, pharma charging too much money, but no one realized like how much money goes into developing the drug.
Yeah.
And that the cost issue is not a pharma issue, it's an industry, I should say healthcare industry, because payers pay they have a lot of influence. In fact, they probably now have more influence than really the industry because of what they will reimburse. So what can the industry or what can policy do to help make people more aware of that so people understand? And it's not that, you hear pharma's charging too much money, and it's not pharma charging too much money. It's all the back things in terms of the business. Pharma can't survive if they can't make money too at the same time. Yes, their number one purpose is for the better of the patient.
Yeah.
So what can policy, industry, to make more aware of what's going on?
Well, the first thing we need to do, it's a beautiful question. The first thing we need to do is stop pointing fingers. Because the reality is, pharmaceutical products in 1965 were at the high end 14% of the overall cost of healthcare. It's the same today. Is that number a lot bigger? Yeah, it is. And the reality is how we're trying to change the model. Drugs shouldn't be as expensive as they are to invent. Okay, we've changed the model. Big pharma companies have outsourced their innovation model. Their pipeline is now by doing deals with small companies. It's cheaper, it's better, it's faster. Ultimately, that means drugs will be more inexpensive.
Better, faster,
when they
but
get
not
to the market.
cheaper.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully we could get there, right? I mean,
No,
hopefully.
I don't think, first of all, drug discovery is not the major component of cost. I'm involved in a lot of small companies now. What most people don't understand, two major costs in a new drug, first of all, clinical trials. I'm involved in a personalized cancer vaccine company now. We're starting a clinical trial now. We're paying major teaching hospitals $60,000 per patient year for everyone in the study. So what the public doesn't understand is a lot of the development cost, it's not the laboratory cost, that's maybe 10-20%, is the money that the big pharma companies pay to major research hospitals to allow them to do the key experiments in patients. And that is huge expenditures. And then the other costs are marketing.
Yeah.
So the industry, first of all, has to get honest. Marketing costs are more than R&D costs. They don't want to admit that.
Well, and then the cost of failures, right? The enormous amount of the cost that goes into developing a drug is going to products that ultimately don't work.
But there's still, I'm in the industry, so maybe I can point as failing. Direct-to-consumer advertising
That's the biggest issue we have.
is a big negative PR issue.
You bet. That's
Every time I turn on TV, which is maybe twice a year at 6 o'clock, and I see a Humira ad, I feel awful. This is not soap powder.
Oh, you should feel good, Bob.
those
You
are some of the
created
nicer
it.
ones.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the other ones you listen to.
The industry should not be doing that.
But from a policy standpoint, what we can do is work with the FDA to change the law so that there is fast-track designation so that the clinical trials aren't so expensive and you have to do so many. So that's what we try to do from a policy standpoint.
But that's not new, and that exists.
Because right
The
now,
FDA is not the
That's an
problem.
example of a success.
but there are 6 designations for fast track right
Sorry, it's
now.
hard to hear
There
you.
are 6 different designations for fast, expedited review, fast track, orphan drugs. So I think there's 6 categories depending on which one you can fall into. So the FDA is already, has those in place in terms of getting a drug to market. I think, as you were saying, that the bulk of the cost is really the development in terms of your clinical trials. And the public doesn't understand that, which kind of has a domino effect where the public doesn't understand. I mean, I know people who work for hospitals who don't understand what a pharmaceutical company will go through in terms of developing a drug. And they're in the healthcare industry. And so I think we need to do a better job as far as an industry in terms of making people understand. It does cost a lot of money. There's no way around it. It's the R&D costs, which is probably 20%, and it's 80% in terms of the development costs. And then than post, like you said, in terms of the marketing costs. The marketing cost is usually about 3 times the budget of what the R&D cost is going to be. But no one understands that.
I think the marketing is a bit of a herring here. First of all, no one really knows what pharma's spending on marketing. But, you know, just to give people a scale of what we're talking about here, our group has looked at the ability of the industry to generate capital for R&D. To just forget, not even your biotech industry, top 50, have invested $1.4 trillion in R&D since 2000. Having that money well spent, well focused, the money is actually, there's a lot of capital being generated. There's also an equal amount in dividends and stock buybacks, and there's you know, 2 or 3 times that in running the companies, the G&A, and the marketing and everything. This is a complex industry, and one of the challenges I think you heard is that certainly at the early stages, biotech is not an assembly line. Discovery is not like, you know, let's build a new car. We know how to build a car. There's no risk in it. There's enormous risk. It's individuals. It's chance encounters. It's an extraordinarily complicated, almost irreproducible process. We haven't learned how to create assembly lines for new drugs yet. The success rate of the smartest venture capital investments is not 100%, and these are smart people. So it is a business issue.
Yeah, if I could
to
add
get
to
this right.
The only way you're going to educate the public on that, and at MassBio we have programming and marketing and communications around working with disease foundations, et cetera, but you really can't move the needle at that small of a level. The only way to fix it is to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Get the big pharma companies to agree to do less direct-to-consumer advertising and utilize that revenue to do you know, public service announcements around what they do. I'd ask you all, go to YouTube and look up Pfizer's commercial called Before I Was a Medicine.
Right.
It's awesome.
They're starting to do that, but I mean, that's going to take time, and it's just one component.
So we're going to
There's-
continue this discussion over lunch because
Okay.
we're going to have we're going to, we hope people will join us. And I do want to respect people's time here and move to the next phase. In closing, thank you, all the Bobs. Bob Coughlin, Bob Kamen, Bob Anderson, and Bob Schultz also for putting this together. Rob Schultz, for putting this all together. Our team, Corey Blanchard, Neil Soler, really. Lunch is down the hall. I would ask everyone not to sort of mob our speakers here, but let us go down the hall where it'll be much easier to have a shared conversation about these critically important issues. Thank you all.